Hello. I think I'm live now. Yowza. Hello. If there's any weirdness or problems with the stream, let me know. And whatever. Otherwise, I will go on now. Boom! It is Starbelly Astrology with me, your host, Owen Briggs. It's me. And we're here. And what are we going to talk about today? Well, we got the very exciting and sexy title, Atlantis and Lemuria, Good Tidings to You Too, Utarakuru. Tips hat. So what are these things and what do they have to do with astrology? Nothing. Hello, Wes. Hello there. My good friend Wes, who I know and love. I've never met you, but why not? Atlantis and Lemuria. So basically what I'm going to do this episode, boom, is talk about history, the history of Earth and human civilization, according to Rudolf Steiner, and according to what I think is ultimately basically as convincing as any other idea I've ever encountered, and it's fun. So we're going to get to it. Basically, according to Rudolf Steiner, and why do I believe this? Why do I believe any of it? I don't necessarily. But see what resonates with you and see what you think. We're going to go through this. And you're welcome to ask questions about astrology at any time if you want, and I'll answer those. So yeah. But basically, according to Steiner, there are roughly seven, I don't know, is it seven? I have no idea really. But there's basically cultural epochs on Earth, time periods. Currently, we are in the Anglo-Germanic period as of about 1483, 1403. I forget the exact numbers. I should have fucking looked them up, but thankfully, with the magic of the internet, I can do that in 2 seconds. So that's what I'll do. But yeah, long story short, there are various periods in human development. Traits come forward, traits are developed. The one immediately prior to this current Anglo-Germanic period was the Greco-Latin period, and of course the subsequent period of European Latin civilization, Catholic more broadly. Not that that was exactly a thing in the way that we know it now back then, but yeah, just more broadly, the development of rationality and reason, from Socrates to Descartes, from Socrates to the modern European philosophers in various ways. So basically, humanity is always changing. Humanity is always changing, developing new traits, refining and elaborating upon previously developed ones. And the most recent faculty, the newest faculty that we're developing in our minds, is a capacity to perceive spiritual things in a state of full consciousness, a capacity to apprehend the synthetic a priori, or in simpler terms, to perceive the spiritual archetypes and forces that are underlying reality. So this is a faculty that we've been developing for the past 600, roughly 500, 600 years. This is a faculty whose leading curve, although there's many exceptions, and I'll get into this later, this is a faculty whose leading curve is developing in the English and the Germanic peoples more broadly currently. Does that make them racially superior? Does that make them better than everyone? No, it doesn't. Not necessarily. But it means that this trait is being developed in the fullest and the newest way among these peoples. And so somebody just has asked now, do you think memes, wow, are an outgrowth of this? And I would say yes. Basically everything that we understand by surrealism, which, memes, in this term, but, which memes basically are, basically everything there, this capacity to directly recognize and understand something that has not been explicitly explained in logical, rational terms, this is what Steiner refers to And these terms are somewhat awkward, but I'm going to use his terms, why not? This is what Steiner refers to as the development of the consciousness soul. Now, last time I talked about the physical body, the etheric body, that's, regulating all of your life forces, the stuff that goes on while you're asleep, your breathing, your heartbeat, that kind of thing, among other things. Your astral body, that's connected to everything that you experience in waking life, emotions, feelings of sympathy or antipathy, attraction and repulsion, that kind of thing. And then the ego, which is the human faculty, which is the capacity to reflect on yourself as yourself and intervene into your own thinking and moral judgments and change yourself and develop and grow as a human being. Your capacity for moral responsibility comes out of this. So, yeah, but there are kind of organs, in the same way as the physical body has organs, these other bodies, the etheric body and the astral body, have organs. And so new faculties are developing in mankind over time, associated, among other things, with these subtle bodies, these bodies of energy that are attached to us and that, substantially compose who we are. Because without a conscious mind and without, life functions, I'm just a corpse, I'm just matter. So new faculties are developing from between roughly 1000 BC and 1500 AD. We were developing a capacity for reason. That's why you get Socrates at the early end of that. That's why you get Plato, Aristotle, all of these people who are really, really advanced. They're leading the curve. They're geniuses at what they do. And then by 1800, when this faculty has grown into mankind in a very deep and full way, you have 10-year-olds writing political essays in France and so on and so forth. So what was once the possession of a small number of geniuses and leading spirits becomes the property of a much broader swathe of mankind. So the same thing is happening now in the same way as we had certain geniuses of the intellect and the reason 2,500, 600 years ago. We have geniuses now of spiritual perception. So, Joe says, are you familiar with Jean Gebser's ever-present origin theory? I've never heard of this character. Perhaps you would like to tell me about it in the comments afterward. But I'm interested. I'm certainly interested in learning about everyone I can. And on that note, I will talk about why I am referring to Steiner so much. Why do I like him? Why do I respect him? Why, out of all of these figures, people talk about Carl Jung, people talk about Freud, people talk about Deleuze, or they talk about Osho, or, some Indian guru or something like that. Why, out of all of these people, do I pick this stuffy, stodgy German man who is fairly obscure, except for the fact that he invented biodynamic farming, basically, Waldorf education, also known as Steiner schools in many places, eurythmy, which I've never really gotten into fully, but he came up with it with the help of a young dancer he was working with. So yeah, why do I pay attention to this guy? Why do I lend him any credence or respect at all? Because he is a clear, logical, rational thinker who does not overstep his bounds. When I read him, fundamentally, why do I like him? Because when I read him, I am experiencing the world like a child again, in a good way, in a renewed way and matured way. Everything is vivid, everything is interesting, everything is life-affirming and beautiful. That's the fundamental reason why I'm into him. And then the fact that on top of that, he can be logical and rational, that's incredible. That's a very, very, very small number of people who can do both the spacey, chaotic, cosmic, crazy thing and be grounded and logical and rational about it. Very small number of people who can combine those two things. And it's a very funny thing because he talks about this. Now, I'm always making digressions. I'm always making digressions here and there, tangents here and there. This is my Mercury square, Saturn, Pisces, Mercury plus Pisces, means tangents, out the wazoo. So yeah, Steiner talks about this, beings, spiritual beings who are influencing life on Earth, and these concepts are abused, but whatever, I'm going to introduce them in a substantial way. Aramman and Lucifer. Aramman is known by the name Satan, Mephistopheles. He's not the devil, not in this framework, and not perhaps in reality either. And then Lucifer. Lucifer is the snake in the Garden of Eden who tempted Adam and Eve to the fall, blah, 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 blah. But this is all, don't bring any kind of prejudices to your understanding of this. Just come fresh with all of this. So long story short, those are the names of the beings, but we can quite concretely link those names and those beings to certain tendencies in human life. Aramman is cold, pessimistic, cynical, nitpicky, logical, rational, incredibly intelligent. But you think of Rick and Morty, as terrible as that show has become, it was really good for the first 2 seasons. You think of the character of Rick. Rick is Aramman, mastery of the material world, cynicism, hopelessness, pessimism, hatred of everything. He's bitter, he's cold, he's whatever. This is your kind of Aramanic character. Reddit materialism, that kind of thing. Lucifer then is your kind of wow, wacky, new age, everything's flying crazy, earthly life doesn't matter, we should abandon earthly life and flee from earthly life and flee into the spirit and go meditate in a cave for 20 years because nothing else matters. This is Lucifer. And so between these two things is Steiner working out of a Christian impulse, because Christ and the heart and love is what balances these two impulses. So yeah, you have to take the visionary, the crazy spiritual side of things, you have to take the logical, consistent side of things, and you need to put them together. And the only way that they can come together is out of a sense of love for the world and for mankind in general. And that doesn't make logical sense right now, that doesn't connect, but I want you to meditate on it and consider it. So love is really what is balancing these two impulses towards the extremes of the spirit on one end and the extremes of matter on the other end. And then, and this is a really fascinating thing actually, the ego, the self which recognizes itself as itself, this apparently is, in a substantial way, Christ. You go back to the scene in the Bible with the burning bush and it says, I am that I am. I am that I am. Well, believe it or not, and I'm just introducing ideas here. You don't have to agree, you don't have to disagree, but just see what resonates with you and see what makes sense to you. According to Steiner, this actually ought to have been translated as I am the I am. I am I amness itself, and that is what is speaking through the burning bush. This connects to the fact that the sun in astrology is connected to your personal identity, yourself, your sense of self, your I, as it were. And according to Steiner, what is Christ ultimately? What is Christ fundamentally? Yes, it's part of the Godhead, but in another sense, in another more limited sense, the Christ is the ruler of the spirits of the sun, playing into earthly life. And again, you're taking this concept of the sun in astrology in a directly observable way, mind you, in a directly observable way. The sun determines your core impulse and your core sense of your own character, and this is observable in other ways. If you've got your sun in your 10th house in astrology, you're born with this, then your name and your face and your career and your identity, they're all going to be one thing. Your individual personality, the sun, is going to come through in your career, 10th house. So we can observe, you can take someone who's been born with their sun in the 10th house, and you can see, oh, 10th house is career, sun is individual personality. So we know that the sun relates to the individual personal impulse. And then when you're taking this concept that the Christ is the ruler of the spirits of the sun, and you're taking this concept that the Christ then brings more of this individuating impulse to earth through the sacrifice on Golgotha, through the crucifixion and resurrection, that kind of thing. Um, all of these things begin to link up. And it's a fascinating thing that Steiner says, that apparently, really, before the crucifixion and the resurrection and all of that, which I believe merely through observation of the consequences, and not exactly through any other form of observation. Again, these are historical events. I don't know how faithfully they've been passed down to us, but you can kind of see the results of something. And the results of this that I perceive, not only in my direct and immediate life, but also in my dealings with past lives, are that love has entered more into the human soul. The pursuit of individuality has entered more into the human soul, into the human spiritual life. We've individuated more and more over time. And this occurred after the crucifixion, historically. Before the crucifixion, things were very, very dark. This is the thing. It was late antiquity. It was, the height of the Roman Empire. Things were so grim. Things were so heavy. Um, it's an amazing thing. When you look back at the spirituality of that time, you look at the Greeks, they're talking about the afterlife as the land of the shades. Why are they talking about this? Why do we have these differing accounts of the afterlife? Why do they differ across time? The Jews in this period are talking about Sheol, whether or not that's how you pronounce it. Again, basically the land of the shades. It's this gray, featureless zone that you go to when you die, roughly. And, there was the old Greek saying, better to be a peasant in the land of the living than a king in the land of the shades, because there was really nothing there. So, and this is another fascinating thing about Steiner, is he reconciles all of these different accounts of the spiritual world that are contradictory. Why are the Greeks talking about basically this gray, featureless zone at this point in time? Why do the Hindus talk about, other things at an earlier time? Why does Christianity talk about the afterlife and whatever in the way that it does? Well, he goes into all of this. And again, the reason I believe it is because I look at the evidence that's around me. I look at my own life. I look at myself. I look into my own soul. And what I see there corresponds to what he says. In some cases, in many cases, there are things I disagree with him about when it comes to astrology. There are other things, he says, for instance, that we tend to, and this is the average, and people are going to deviate from the average more and less, but particularly exceptional individuals in any sense. And we all know that's not most people by definition. So if you meet anyone who's a bit unique or out of the way, they're going to differ from this rule, this average. According to him, the average is roughly one male incarnation and one female incarnation per cultural epoch. And so this is bringing it all back to the beginning, where we were talking about the Anglo-Germanic epoch beginning around, let's say 1500. That's a very rough estimate, but 1500. There is an exact year that I was trying to look up on my phone earlier. And maybe, in fact, I will do that now as I talk to you. So, yeah, but yeah, per cultural epoch, Anglo-Germanic epoch, one male, one female incarnation. Greco-Latin epoch, one male, one female incarnation. This is what the average is going to be. So, yeah. However, my experience has been with looking into past lives, my own past lives, other people's past lives of friends, that kind of thing, with this technique I have, which is related to Reiki. It's called dialoguing. Uh, I don't know anyone who teaches it for money. I certainly wouldn't teach it for money. Um, but that's how I get this information, basically. Somebody was asking me about this yesterday, and I'm going to email her and tell her this in case she doesn't see it here. In any case, yeah, one incarnation per epoch. So I've been seeing things, happen more often. Cultural epochs last about 2,600 years, roughly. So that would be one incarnation every 1,300 years, roughly. And we're getting an interesting question here about the age of Aries, age of Aquarius. There is something here directly related to that, which I'll get to in a second. So yeah. So what have I found with my own incarnations? Not once every 1,300 years, more like once every 500, 400, 700, 600. I've noticed that if you have a shorter life, you're going to reincarnate again sooner. This is something that Steiner observes as well. Um, But yeah, so somebody's just asked me about the age of Aries, Aquarius, blah, 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 blah. Well, this is the interesting thing. Steiner does link the zodiac signs up with these cultural epochs and says that this current age, the age of what he calls the consciousness soul, the capacity for conscious clairvoyance, pursuit of spiritual beings and forces, that kind of thing, that is the age of Pisces within his framework. And there is a kind of reverse procession through the zodiac. So, current cultural epoch, Anglo-Germanic epoch, is the age of Pisces. And again, there's other things going on with this epoch. The Japanese are doing things, Chinese are doing things, Africans are black people, whatever, they're doing things, tons of things. All of these old forces persist. And even 2,000 years ago, you can see, well, where was all of this Christian stuff happening? It came out of the Jews. And this was not their epoch. Their epoch was long past on Atlantis, and I'll get to that later. But so yeah, long story short, age of Aries, Greco-Latin epoch. Aries, the intellect. And you look at some of the symbolism around this era, and again, don't read too much into symbolism, blah, 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 blah. People get really confused about it, so it's important to focus on brass tacks and on what you can see and experience and know directly, rationally, clearly. But yeah, you look, the lamb, Christ the lamb, Aries, sheep, Aries. This is how it is. The Vesica Pisces, the Jesus fish, that's a Pisces thing as well. You go back earlier, you've got the cult of the bull, the age of Taurus. This was the era before the Greco-Latin era. This was the Egyptian, Chaldean, Babylonian era. This was the age of Taurus. So, they had a cult of the bull. And then you've got the Hindus, and they've still got their cult of the bull, that kind of thing. And at that point, you reach the end of recorded history. So, you're going to notice not only do we have these epochs, it's as complicated as any other thing. It's as complicated as any other real science. Biology can't be summed up in 2 seconds, nor can this. So, you've got all of these other impulses going on at the same time. You've got 0 BC, 0 AD, Christ, blah, 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 all of that happening. You've got, and that's in the middle of the age of Aries, the Greco-Latin epoch, the fourth post-Atlantean epoch, as the Anglo-German is the fifth post-Atlantean epoch, and the Egyptian, Chaldean, Babylonian is the third post-Atlantean epoch. So then there's two more before that. And the post-Atlantean epoch has also been referred to as the Aryan epoch before that term became associated with certain racist ideologies, blah, 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 but it's just a term, whatever. So yeah, we've got the beginning of recorded history, basically, in this Age of Taurus, Egyptian, Chaldean epoch, spanning roughly, let's say, 1000 BC to 3600 BC. Then before, we have what is called the ancient Persian epoch, the prehistoric Persian epoch, because humanity only began recording things in a form that could be passed down or found in writing with that third post-Atlantean Egyptian Chaldean epoch. Before then, yeah, we had the emergence of Zoroastrianism. We had the High Persian culture. And Persians, of course, are different to Arabs. genetically, whatever. They're different to the other inhabitants of the Middle East. You know, they have blue eyes and whatever, stuff like that. They have sort of a superiority complex about this, I hear. I think everybody has a superiority complex. Very many races have that. Some of them, you know, the way I see it though, is everybody has their contribution to make. The Japanese are the best at something. They can do things I can't do. You know, I'm English and like 3/16 Irish or something. There are things Germans can do that I can't do. There are things the French can do that I can't do. There are things Africans and stuff can do that I can't do. Yeah. So everyone's got their own little contribution to make. And, you know, the fact that I've gotten into reincarnation has made me far more relaxed about all of this racial stuff because it's like, well, if I was a woman, if I was brown, if I was whatever, you know, what does it matter that I'm white right now? It matters something, it means something, but it's not an absolute and final meaning. It's not the most important thing. And so it shouldn't be the most important thing for you either. I think it's just more one interesting, fascinating little facet of who you and I are. And that's how I like to study it. So, you know, I'm not shy about this stuff. In any case, so we have the ancient Persian epoch, the origination of Zoroastrianism. This is where we get, you know, Aramman, Ahura Mazda, blah, 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 blah. These are the Zoroastrian deities. And then before that, because, you know, we don't have as much to say about that one because it's not in recorded history, so we're going to skip over these and we're going to go even further back into Atlantis in a moment. Before the ancient Persian epoch was the ancient Indian or Vedic epoch. And, you know, these are not the Indians that we have today necessarily, partly, but, you know, things change over time. You know, back in Roman times, you know, the English and Germanic peoples were living in huts and killing each other with axes and stuff. So, you know, things changed. People move up, down, all around, that kind of thing. So, yeah, we had the Vedic epoch. We had the period during which, you know, people would run off into the forest and meditate for 40 years and consciously map out every sensation that they were possibly experiencing and attempting to and attempting to just escape their prejudices about reality, about the reality that they'd been born into. People knew things back then. People had a more conscious experience of their past lives back then, something that we've lost in the past 2,000 years or so, with some exceptions. You know, there's famous cases like, what's his name, Arthur Flowerdew or something. He was taken to Jordan in the Middle East, in the Levant, more like the Levant, I think. Um, and you know, he was mapping out all of these ancient sites from memory, places he'd never been. He was telling the archaeologist, you know, okay, dig there and you'll find that, and things were found. So it's a very interesting case. Arthur Flowerdew. I am going to look into this immediately. But while I do that, I'm also going to tell you now about Atlantis. So, okay, we got to the first post-Atlantean epoch. What were the Atlantean epochs? Well, this is very interesting because the final post-Atlantean epoch was the Mongolian epoch, as it's referred to. And this is where, basically, and yes, it is Arthur Flowerdew. If you're interested in that past life crazy thing, Arthur Flowerdew, look him up. It's a very simple name. So yes, and you know, just make of it what you will. I'm not saying it's hard proof of anything necessarily, but look into it. It's interesting. You should look into this stuff, think about it for yourself, and come to your own conclusions. So yeah, we had the final Atlantean epoch, which was the Mongolian epoch. This is where we get the Asian peoples, the East Asian, Chinese, etc. peoples. And you know, yeah, they branched off. Koreans are different to Japanese, Japanese are different to Chinese and Mongolians and blah, 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 blah. But this is where we get the root of those races. So, and I'll just go through this very quickly because they get kind of more abstract and less related to what we currently understand of the modern races, like who's what and where they came from and stuff like that. And this is a very funny thing because Rudolf Steiner was asked about the Neanderthal skeleton Neanderthal remains? Why have they got that kind of weird sloped back forehead and different skeleton? According to him, those are transitional Atlantean forms, Atlantean to Aryan, post-Atlantean. I'll get references to these for anyone who asks. Otherwise, I won't bother. You just ask in the comments if you want something and I'll post it for you. Because it's tedious to find this stuff for no one in particular, you know what I mean? Anyway, so we got the Mongolians. They're the seventh Atlantean epoch, cultural epoch. Before that, we have the Akkadians. And you may know this term from related to Sumeria, Sumer and Akkad. That's the modern civilization. So you have the Akkadians. And with each of these epochs, again, you have a certain special development. You have a certain impulse being brought forth. The Akkadians were the first to really understand law as a thing. And the Atlanteans, in fact, did not have anything like the reason and rationality that we have today. They simply had, in a sense, they had memory. They had very, very powerful memories. I'm going off Steiner's accounts. You can judge this for yourself, but I think that's the last time I need to say that. So they had very powerful memories. They had certain psychic abilities. They were able to utilize the etheric energy in the seeds of plants to power vehicles, stuff like that. And here's a mistake that a lot of people make when they think about Atlantis. And it's like, well, who the fuck is thinking about Atlantis, Owen? Who are you even talking about? Well, anyone. If you're into this stuff, apart from hearing me talking about it, you're basically going to hear people talk about Atlanteans. Edgar Casey, I don't trust him at all. Don't trust him. He may have delivered some truths, but it's like a limited hangout type thing. They give you a kind of a half truth, or whatever beings were speaking through him or working through him. They give you a kind of a half truth so that they can sell you on something that's not true. It's a classic tactic because it works. So, yeah, basically, many of these people will look at Atlantis and it will just be like, oh, anatomically modern and, intellectually modern, just regular human beings from today, except 10,000 years ago with better technology and blah, oh, and they had the internet and they had TV and stuff like that. That's not how it was, as far as I understand it. And at the very least, we can say that that is not how you should presume it was. Why would you assume that mankind or the face of the earth looked like it does now? You shouldn't. There's no good reason to assume it. So this is where Steiner really differs from a lot of other accounts in a way that I think is interesting and legitimate. Basically saying these people were alien to us. They were living in more of a spiritualized world because, there's been a gradual descent into matter from the spirit in the same way as we reincarnate and enter into earthly life, leave earthly life, go through spiritual things on the in-between, blah, 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 blah. So too does the earth. And this is a fascinating thing about Steiner's account is he gives you basically the incarnation of the earth itself reincarnates, the universe dies and passes away into spirit and reincarnates. And the earth, as we know it, is the fourth incarnation of the universe. And there will ultimately be 7, according to him. And so you notice this number 7. Can I prove this? Is this legitimate? Decide for yourself. 7 cultural epochs per period. The Aryan or post-Atlantean period. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. We're on number 5 right now, the Anglo-Germanic. Next, it will be the Slavic, some distant future Slavic type thing. And then after that, it will be some way distant future American or Philadelphian type thing. And that will close us out of this era. But yeah, things are alien, things are weird, things are always changing. And you cannot assume it's anachronistic to assume that just because things are a certain way today, that they were that way back way in the past. And the further you go, the more alien it gets. And this is partly what I was saying yesterday about looking at your reincarnations is they get alien, they become alien. They're not intellectually, emotionally modern in a way that's recognizable or comprehensible to us. They have distinctly alien values that we have to assimilate and make sense of. And because of our prejudices coming from the modern world as we do, it can be difficult to understand and to make space to assimilate these alien qualities and to really understand them on their own terms, as opposed to our terms projected backwards in time. So with the Atlanteans, they were not dealing with rationality and reason. They were not inventing things and conceiving things in their mind. It was partly this weird process of like trial and error, and also receiving of teachings from spiritual beings. And again, this is a lot to swallow, but this is just me giving my account of something that makes about as much sense to me as the standard view. Like I explained yesterday, the Big Bang. Nothing exploded, and somehow the universe was composed of these, rules and physical laws that meant it was able to persist and develop in the way it has. How is that a given? Where did those laws come from? None of it, there's no foundation to the whole thing, there's no bottom to it. So for me, I'm just open to comparing these ideas with what I see around me. And for various reasons, over many years, just making these comparisons, making these observations. Steiner's account, where you've got Atlantis, you've got blah, 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 the modern period, you've got spiritual beings, ultimately makes more sense to me than anything else. And again, it vivifies my life. I asked myself in my early 20s, what the point of it all was. Why am I here? What am I meant to do with my life? I needed to know that before I could take the first step, because what's the point of taking even a single step in any direction before you know what it's ultimately going to end in? I mean, if you spend your life on something, I looked around me, I saw people wasting their lives on crap that didn't matter, even in mundane terms, even without, stretching my brain too far, I could see people were wasting their lives on crap that didn't matter. And then I could see Napoleon or I could see Alexander the Great, and it's like, okay, well, these people achieved great things in some respect, yes. But if I believe the materialistic view, then every memory of them is going to be erased. Everyone who might ever have known or cared about them will be erased, and it will all become completely meaningless. This is the worldview I was struggling to break out of, attempting to discover the truth in. And it turns out it did not have a lot of truth in it at all when you take it apart intellectually on its own terms, on the terms it presents to you, as its own proof. It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any more sense than anything else. So, at first I turned to Christianity. I turned to more conventional Christianity in kind of a mundane, naive way. I converted to Catholicism for a handful of months before I just had questions that I couldn't answer with reference to that framework. But I retained this idea that there is a greatest good and a highest good, and that the best thing that one could possibly do is to devote oneself to that highest good in the fullest way possible. And that whatever that involved, if that involved like cutting my own head off or jumping off a cliff or doing some tedious work for 50 years or something like that, I would do it because ultimately it would be worth it. It's the greatest good by definition. So I decided that the best thing to do would be to investigate this intellectually, to figure out, okay, what's the greatest good? Well, in order to know that, I have to know how can I know what the greatest good is? And in order to know that, I have to know how I can know anything at all, how I can be certain of anything at all. Well, long story short, after some investigation for a few months, I came to the conclusion there was no answer to any of those questions. And I had this remarkable experience where my thinking simply stopped. I could sit for 20 minutes and just experience nothing and kind of be happy. And what's more than that, the seat of my consciousness moved. It didn't move, it was just as though one layer of it was taken away and it revealed another layer. It, it was no longer in my head, it was in my chest, it was in my heart. And then, I have this experience, and then 5 years later, I read some obscure passage of Steiner where he talks about this. He talks about this being something that is gradually happening to various segments of humanity at various rates. That the seat of consciousness is moving out of the head and into the chest, into the heart. And it's stuff like that, you know, where I read Steiner and I've had some question bouncing around in my head for years on end, and he's the only guy who can even make any comment on it that relates to it in any way at all, and perhaps also answers it. You know, this is why I got into him. There's a lot of answers in there. There's a lot of really, really interesting, deep ideas in there. Even if you don't want to get into the spiritual stuff, his book, Philosophy of Freedom, is pretty heavy, dry in some respects, but there's a lot of good stuff in there. And, you know, he says that anyone who understands that book will understand every other thing he's going to talk about. Not that I would recommend you read it necessarily. I would recommend starting out with Occult Science. There's a particular translation that's good. I might post that in the description. Anyway, I'll move on. So yeah, I realized there was no way of proving anything logically at all, that all thoughts were kind of instantly self-defeating, self-undoing, self-negating, that, you know, I would simply have a thought when I was in this state, and there would be a million reasons to pick it apart, a million counter assumptions that I could make about why it could possibly be wrong, why there was some unknown. And think about this, you know, think about this. Think about the unknown unknowns and what they mean philosophically and what they mean for you. At any time, you could discover some information that you never anticipated that would recontextualize every other piece of information that you've ever gotten a hold of. Somebody asks if I have any placements on the fixed star Algol. Yes, I have my sun on Algol, but I don't know anything about fixed stars. I found that out early in the game, and I never really paid attention to it since. In any case, yeah, there's just a million reasons, a million assumptions that you can make about why any thought that you may possibly have will be wrong. And so I had this experience. I was able to say to myself, there is no way of being certain of anything, ever, at all. But I still have to live. I still have to put my pants on in the morning, you know? And I still have things I want to do intellectually. I can still enjoy building logically consistent structures, and that's what I do with astrology, you know, looking into the evidence and comparing things, putting it together, and trying to build the most internally, if not absolutely consistent intellectual structure that I'm capable of building, simply because I find it fun. And you know what better reason is there to do something? So, yeah, Algol is connected to the idea of losing one's head. Okay, interesting stuff. I'll maybe look into it at some point. But yeah, basically, this is all you can do. You just work with what is immediately apparent around you. And again, some unknown could come into your life and blow your head apart, destroy your world completely. You could wake up, you could unplug from the Matrix or something stupid like that, like Total Recall, and just realize that every single moment prior to then had been a lie. That can happen at any time, for any reason. It hasn't happened to me yet, in an absolute and radical way, but that's no reason to rule it out. You know, David Hume, who is sort of a weird guy and sort of an idiot in some ways, but, you know, he says just because the sun has come up every day before now doesn't mean it will come up tomorrow. This is true. This is true. You cannot be certain. You cannot guarantee any of this. And so, yeah, I went through this period, this process, but life goes on. Life goes on, and you still have to feed yourself and put your pants on in the morning. And, but life was different. Life was different after that. I became radically open to any idea. There was no way I could prove or disprove anything, so why not just entertain things? Why not entertain concepts and see where they go? And you know, this led me to think of things more in terms of what resonated with me and what had a sense of vividness, as opposed to what made logical sense immediately in terms of what I had already believed prior to that moment. So, you know, I was going by these vivid experiences. I had an experience I'll get to that later, but I had some very strange experiences. I realized that, there was nothing else really to go on but intuition. Looked at from the materialistic framework, as I said before, you could be Alexander the Great, you could be Ramesses, or any of these ancient kings or emperors or conquerors, or any of these great intellects or whatever. And if it's merely a material world, you're just going to be a blip on the radar. You're going to be there for 2 seconds, leave your little drop in the bucket, if that, and then die. And then in 3,000 years, either the story about you will be so distorted that it no longer bears any resemblance to you or what you did, or you'll be forgotten completely. And then in another 10,000, you'll certainly be forgotten completely, if this is how things are. So in the materialist framework, there's no reason to live. You should just die. You should sincerely just kill yourself, because as Silenus, the satyr, said to Solomon or something like that, or some other Greek figure, you know, it is better to have never been born. If all these things that you think are true, it is better never to have been born. And this is the conclusion that many people reached in the 2010s when they were exposed to this radical cosmic materialism. This is what I was going through at the same period. It's what everyone was going through. It was the Pisces Capricorn era, Neptune Pisces Pluto Cap. So Pluto Cap is like deep, brutal materialism, Darwinism, that kind of thing. Neptune Pisces is like cosmic thinking, grand, global, biggest possible context. Put them together and you get this extreme cosmic pessimism, as again represented by something as stupid as the cartoon Rick and Morty. There you go. It was in everything. And now it's over. It's a new era. New things are happening. And we don't quite know what they'll be yet because it's all so fresh, but I'm looking forward to it. So yeah, in the materialist framework, there's no reason to live. In the conventional Christian or any dogmatic religious framework, there's no way of proving any of these dogmatic assertions. And you need proof. We need proof. So this is a modern age. We're developing this modern intellect that wants and can achieve proof of certain ideas. This is what we've got to work with, and this is what Steiner works with, and this is why I take him seriously, and this is why I use this term spiritual science, because it is applying a logical, rational method to the understanding of spiritual things, to the interpretation of spiritual experiences, and so on and so forth. And it is not asking you to obey any stupid, dogmatic, cult-like dictates. You focus on your individuality, you build your individuality, you work out of yourself and your own impulses, but you do so in a logical and sensible way, in a grounded way. So yeah. So yeah, that's basically where I'm at now. And then in the context of that, I just enjoy reading about Atlantis and all of this spooky, crazy, creepy stuff, which I'll now talk to you about more. So yeah, so we had 7th Atlantean cultural epoch, Mongolian, 6th Atlantean cultural epoch, Akkadian. Then the 5th Atlantean cultural epoch is what is referred to as primal Semitic. And the 5th period forms the seed for the next big period. So the primal Semitic race, or root race, or whatever you want to call it, became the foundation of the Aryan races. And, that's going to upset pretty much everyone because it's going to upset the Nazis and it's going to upset the people who don't like the term Aryan. They're basically derived from the same root. And they have a lot in common in some ways. It's a very interesting thing. So the Israelites, the Phoenicians, these are Semitic peoples, Also more broadly, the Near Eastern, Fertile Crescent, Sumerian, Babylonian peoples, I think broadly are what is referred to as Semitic. And yeah, and then we get also the Aryans, the people roaming around in chariots and killing everyone and taking over everything and all of that kind of thing, as far as I understand it. Of course, these days they're referred to in the more polite term Proto-Indo-European. But yeah, that's about the size of it. So yeah, the primal Semites. This was their high civilization. They had their own period on Atlantis where they were, the leading curve of development of this new impulse, which then spreads, of course, into every other race in its own weird way, hybridizes with them. Just as the Anglo-Germanic broadly clairvoyant impulse can move into the rational races of Spain, France, Italy, so on and so forth. Uh, every impulse at its time has moved into other races subsequently. Obviously, the Chinese can write essays and do mathematics and so on. They are not the context in which all of that developed initially, but they take it up in their own unique way and they take it in their own unique direction, that kind of thing. So, yeah, Atlantis, more broadly, yeah, it was not a matter of your intellect, but of the strength of your psychic capacities. There is this thing called vril. Vril. Well, this is a modern term, but according to Steiner, there was the science fiction, broadly, occult science fiction story in the Victorian era, late 1800s, called The Coming Race or The Power of Vril. And it's about these people who live underground and they have these magic staves and they do all of this kind of magic stuff. And according to Steiner, it was not that far from the truth of how things went back then. Again, in the same way as your intelligence, alongside a few other things like what you're born into and so on and so forth, largely determines your position on Earth in society today. Your psychic capacities determined your position in society on Atlantis. So, yeah, and of course, as we developed our intellect, we've lost those psychic capacities, and it's been a process of you kind of lose something more primitive or earlier to gain something that's newer in some way, more advanced in some sense. Like, if you grow up out of animality into a self-conscious moral state, you don't have that instinctive power. You don't have the strength of an ape, you don't have the agility of a monkey or something like that. You've got this intellect and this capacity to reflect on yourself and build in a way which is ultimately, better and more useful than those other things, but sacrifices must be made in order to get there. So then you're going to ask, oh, well, does that mean certain races are more advanced than others? No, no. They're just on different trajectories. It's kind of like asking if whales are better than monkeys. They're different. They're different. Um, it's a funny thing. Blacks apparently, that whole stream, that whole route comes from even earlier than Atlantis. It comes from Lemuria, where there was not even that sense of memory. It was more about, can you demonstrate your capacity to perform some deed directly in front of me now? With Atlantis, it was more, oh, these stories, here's these stories, these ancestors, this heritage, so on and so forth. But back on Lemuria, it was even more primitive and simple in one sense. But then that simplicity is taken in subsequent epochs and it's taken in new directions. And again, yeah, I mean, of, you should think of the vitality and the musical talent and so on that blacks display. And whatever, I don't want to reduce them to that and blah, blah, blah. And there's it's a minefield talking about these stuff these days. I don't need to tell you. But yeah, they do have this immediate capacity to put forth some energy. They've got this immediate vitality and charisma that comes through very strongly in their music, which frankly, I appreciate more than somebody's capacity to design a highly elaborate killing machine or something like that. Um, they're taking different impulses and developing them along a different trajectory. So all of these things are an important part of the story, all of these developments. It's just that you look at the Germans or the English, and they're on the far side of this kind of tree of life. They're on the far side of this cladistic diagram, where many things about them are fundamentally more recent, but in other ways they're weaker in certain capacities, they're stronger in certain capacities. Blacks, on the other hand, or Indians or Australian Aboriginals. And again, there's more advanced examples of these races, and there's less advanced examples. You know, there's people who are just living in squalor, not improving their situation. There's people, you look at Rwanda in Africa, it's ridiculously clean. They seem to have things pretty well worked out over there, as opposed to like South Sudan or something. But yeah, and then you look at the Australian Aboriginals, and it's just very sad, and they don't seem to be doing that well. And I feel for them, but you know, there's no point pretending they're more capable than they are. And I know that's going to be controversial, but let's be frank, that was the 2010s. It was just kind of like gassing people up and acting like they're great when really the material's not there. And it's not a sin for those materials not to be there. You know, it's not a reason to completely rule somebody out just because they're not intelligent or they're not capable of living a certain kind of life. And this is what I absolutely hate about the pseudo morality of the 2010s is just pretending that everybody has to be white, everybody has to be a civilized, modern, and you know, also very obedient and domesticated white person fundamentally. They don't. And it's just a bunch of neurotic whites. And this is what fucking white people do as well. You know, everyone's got their sins. Everyone's got their sins. And they differ by race, but everyone's got them. Whites are hypocritical. They are morally too in love with themselves, too proud. They are concerned with all of this ridiculous fake morality and conformity that doesn't get them anywhere. You know, and they have a lot to answer for as well. Everybody does. But you know, that was the 2010s. It's the emperor's new clothes. Let's all pretend nobody has anything to answer for. And hopefully things will just work out. Meanwhile, of course, the rot's deeper than ever before. Our freedoms are being taken away, that kind of thing. You know, you saw the virus, you saw what happened there, you saw the massive theft financially and in other ways that occurred under the guise of helping us, protecting us from that virus. You know, you saw 9/11, you saw the Iraq War, 2 million dead for money, for power, for whatever else. And we'll just perhaps decided to pretend. No, we didn't decide to pretend. The media forced this on us to a great extent. This idea that oh, the moment somebody gets into power, they stop scheming, they stop collaborating with other people, secretly or otherwise. They stop playing games. It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't hold up to scrutiny. You know what I mean? Anyway, I'll end that there. But yeah, and then with all of that, then you've got Atlantis, then you've got Lemuria, then you've got apparently this entire history of Earth that has nothing to do with anything that we've been taught. How do you guarantee any of it? How can you be certain of any of it? The answer is very, very, very gradually and bit by bit by bit by bit by bit, if at all. Otherwise, you can just say, well, you know, I don't know, and I don't particularly need to know. But for me, in order to live the fullest life possible as human beings with the greatest agency possible, and to develop ourselves to the fullest extent, you know, it is best to know what kind of a universe we're living in, what kind of a society we're living in. And so I have attempted to find that out to the best of my ability for the entirety of my adult life, for as long as I've been intellectually capable of that. That's led me to astrology. That's led me to Rudolf Steiner. That's led me to legitimate forms of Reiki. And it will lead me to other places, I'm sure. You know, it's led me to reincarnation. But it's always about keeping things clean, keeping things sober, and keeping things evidence-based, and knowing what kinds of evidence you can trust and what you can't trust. You know, I saw this ridiculous documentary last night about this guy, Nature Boy. He was this black cult guy, melanation, carbonation, that kind of thing. And I hate cults. I distinctly hate cults. People say these things to me all the time. Oh, and you should be a cult leader. Oh, and you could totally be a cult leader. I don't want to be. You're surrounded with these creepy, dependent, just stupid, low agency people who you have to babysit. And the whole benefit of this is that, oh, you get to feel like a big man for 2 seconds if you're an idiot and you don't really know anything about anything. I don't want that. I've never wanted anything like that. What I want is equals. I want people who can think. I want to be around people who can lead their own lives and govern themselves like adults. And then I want to, with them, collectively enhance all our freedom. I want to live a free adult life as opposed to this domesticated slave existence that we're offered by society. You slave away to make money for someone who hates you and laughs at you for 60 years, then you get a boat or something. Toys for adults. It's stupid, you know? So, yeah, understanding astrology, understanding reincarnation, understanding the history of Earth, whatever it looks like, understanding race, understanding your own roots in a way that empowers you and makes you more individual. That's what I want to do. And that's what I want to help other people do. I ultimately want to empower people to be as individual as they possibly can be, because that is what I enjoy. There's no moral imperative, there's no duty, there's no Kantian anything there. I'm doing it because I enjoy it and because I love doing it, because it gives me a feeling of vividness and vitality in life. So that is what I will continue to do. And I will make a brief review of the comments here. I've been doing really talky, lectury things for past 2 days, but we can look here at the comments. Good tidings. Do 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 do. Jean Gebsu. Do 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 do. Okay. Dan Waits. Okay, not to mindlessly name drop, but Dan Waits, World Astrology Report on YouTube, according to Uttarakuru, has good videos on how Steiner's historical epoch observations line up nicely with astrological events. I doubt it. I doubt it. I'm going to look into it and get back to you, but I sincerely doubt it. Including Pluto-Neptune cycles, which weren't even discovered at that point. We will see. Uttarukaru. Viewer. I will leave now. Goodbye.